I want to just assume without argument that we're on track to AGI within 10 years. It may or may not be true, but I don't care for present purposes. Let's assume that's true. So we're playing the game of thinking through what's going to happen. Now, if that's true, then every human institution that currently exists will be transformed. Government, educational institutions, everything that we do, every form of coordination that takes place between people will be transformed. Eventually in profound and fundamental ways, but initially in gradual ways. And that's going to take place already this year, next year. We can see, like, the discussion around cheating with ChatGPT in universities is like this kind of storm in a teacup. I don't know. It's like this very strange discussion to see people having it. I mean, it's good, I suppose, that people are waking up to these things, but that issue in particular seems so minute to me. So I want to talk about not only, so last week, well, a doctor was here and we were discussing how these kinds of technologies might be incorporated into seminars. This week it's listening to us and reacting, hopefully in a constructive way. That's a new player, right? So the AI is a new contributor to an existing institution, an existing discussion, an existing format. A seminar is a very old human institution, and it's embedded in something metauni, which is pretty similar to institutions that have been around for a long time. What I want to talk about today, or at least my proposal, is not just new players, but new games. So here's just one thought experiment to get us started. So right now we have this AI, it's sitting in the seminar, contributing to some degree. Here's what I can imagine happening soon. So this AI is kind of like Adam's shadow, right? It has access to his books. It's kind of not only his books, but some books I imagine are kind of aligned with how I think about Adam, things like George Dyson's books. So he can configure that and refine it to be more like the way he thinks by referring to more of his written material and also unwritten material and books that he chooses and so on. Now, that will never be a perfect replication of Adam, but it's kind of a front end to his way of thinking. And because he's produced a lot of written text, the front end may be fairly good. Now, here's a game you could play. Suppose both Adam and I produce two such shadows. So I have a mini-me and Adam has a mini-me. Then we can sit those AIs together somewhere. They don't have to be represented in a virtual world, but they have a conversation for 6 virtual weeks. And then they distill all that down to the 4 topics that would be most productive for Adam and I to discuss in the next seminar. What if you come to every meeting with another person having suggestions for the deep areas of alignment that maybe you're not aware of that would be profitable to discuss, which you have not discussed in the previous 60 hours of disruption seminars? That's totally doable. We could do it right now. That's an example of a new game, right? That's like a kind of interaction between people that just does not exist currently. So I think we can maybe talk about that as an example, but more generally, I want to discuss what's going to evolve as these technologies become more and more deeply integrated, not only as tools, but into the very fabric of interactions between people. Do we want shadows like that?
Yeah, I think that this raises an interesting point about the limitations of what reasoning by analogy and or reasoning via simple extrapolation from the past. This example of yours, Dan, reveals some of the limits of that. And we do see similar limits for disruptions of other kinds, where a nice way of a nice metaphor for that that's been evoked in the past by others is and I forget the exact quote, but it's something like nothing, superficially, nothing about a caterpillar suggests that it's going to become a butterfly. And other metaphors have been invoked as well. You know, the acorn doesn't, on its surface, look like anything like the oak tree that it will grow into. And so this is an old-standing sentiment, a long-standing sentiment that past experience is not necessarily a good predictor of the future, and that reasoning by analogy from past experiences is often very limited. And I think that so anyway, with that framing in terms of general principles, I think the specific example, and I'll draw another one here as well to go along with it, but the specific example you noted, Dan, is where these AI tools are not necessarily going to insert completely new or independent agents, and are not necessarily going to replace or substitute on a one-to-one basis human agents that are in institutions already, but rather they have this entirely new role to play. And this is one example of something like that you've described. Maybe I can think of or we can think of some others, but in the role that you described, this new augmenting role has, you know, if it has any of the features of standard agents that we're familiar with, it doesn't share all of those features. It has some things that are very different. So it's quite alien that you could imagine these shadows, as you're calling them, these sort of partial agents or unconscious intelligences, them entering into a function in which they effectively telescope the timescale upon which a person's mind is able to work and draw insights and generate content from which to stimulate the production of knowledge or other action. And in this case, you talked about, you could take two bots, shadows of existing people, and have them have a conversation faster than in real time and draw insights out of that. It's a fascinating thought experiment, a marvelous possibility to imagine, and probably something that's going to happen very soon and be extraordinarily impactful. Another example of that, kind of pivoting that maybe by 90 degrees from time into space, is, you could imagine that spatially too. Why have it be limited to just one agent? Why not have 2 or 5 or 10 or 20 or 100 agents having that conversation? In other words, why not replicate entire teams behind you? And that could be either in real time or in accelerated time, and so there is what we see is just an explosion of the what might you call it, a working space? Maybe not a possibility space, but perhaps an explosion of the mental working space around individual people, individual human beings today. And these are not general AIs. It's the potential of narrow artificial intelligence, as we've defined it in the past, to explode those boundaries of what just through augmenting with these extraordinary intelligence services, augmenting what an existing person could do or could achieve. And it is an astonishing thing to think about. And there are there are implications. There's almost an endless supply of implications to think about, because the real challenge is trying to imagine anything this does not affect in our lives. I think that is the harder challenge. Can you think of anything that will remain untouched by the disruptive impacts of this new artificial intelligence technology? So I don't know if there's a whole lot of substance there, but I think we could maybe we could then try to wrap this in a framework with maybe some categories. Like, what are sort of dimensions of performance that you could augment if you had the capacity to multiply certain intellectual tasks as instances of your own faculties, or partial instances of your own faculties. You know, along what dimensions could you expand or explode that capability? Dan, you mentioned time. I think we can do that in terms of, you know, space is maybe not the right way to think about it, but certainly just multiple instances instead of just one of you. I mean, that's you know, and this is a staple of science fiction, right? Even before, even not necessarily with these kind of AI in mind. If you go back, you know, generations in science fiction, you get ideas of like people cloning themselves so that, you know, there are 2 or 3 of the same person and they can get more done in the same amount of time. I mean, these are fun old ideas that have been explored somewhat in the science fiction arena, and now here we are, you know, as ever, science fiction becoming science fact.
Let me draw a line through a few dots to do with this
sure,
parallelism idea. So this is already true today of say YouTube and the internet. So I'm, despite these technologies like YouTube and web pages being at this point ancient, very few academics take use of them to a great extent, in the sense that, you know, the best way to attract students is to have videos of the shit you do on YouTube, right?
Right.
Because
right.
Google really loves YouTube. It prioritizes it in search. You know, I'm not spending a lot of time going out there to look for students. Students come to me, and I don't know exactly how they find me. Obviously, you know, if they're undergraduates at the University of Melbourne, they interact with me in a class, they find me. But you know, people get in touch with me from around Australia and internationally. They've come across my work. Usually it's through Googling various terms, or through, you know, hitting on one of my YouTube videos or something. So the work you can get done by just having the stuff you do out there for the current generation of AIs to look at, meaning like old school AIs, things like Google search, is underappreciated by many people. And that's a form of parallelism, right? So there's like a pretty weak, non-interactive version of me out there in videos talking a lot of the time. And through that, it's kind of like a filter that directs people to the real me. And of course, I have very little attention compared to those scalable versions of me. So, you know, I can't take 1,000 students, and nor do I want to. But in terms of, yeah, I mean, having parallelizable versions of you in the form of a chatbot is a kind of extension of that idea, right? But a much more engaging, potentially useful form, which gets close to being able to do some of the initial interactions. So usually what happens when I meet a student for the first time is that I say a bit about what I do. I go through many of the things I do, and I kind of see what they're interested in, and I know a bit about their background, so I focus on the things I think they might be interested in. That could pretty easily be done, maybe already by the systems that exist or near-term systems. I'm not saying I want to offload that to the AI because it's my initial meeting with a student, right? So it's part of the process, and I like it and I enjoy it. But it doesn't seem to me harmful for that to be available in a very low friction way, just sitting out there, right? So that's the kind of thing that will be, you know, I could do that right now. Right?
Yeah, that's it's amazing to think through that. Let me take a step back to something you said earlier. You mentioned YouTube, and YouTube is an interesting example of an older phenomenon, which is the radical expansion of reach that technology gives to communication, to voice, to an individual's voice, an individual's, you know, the information emanating from an individual. 500 years ago, without telecommunications, the bandwidth with which any individual person could communicate to others was severely limited. You would have to pass something word by mouth, or word of mouth, for the most part. And to a far lesser extent, 500 years ago, it was just becoming possible to print in large quantities, which of course extended the reach of communications, not just in space and in across vast distances, but also numbers of instances. So you could pass on by word of mouth a message, through many other speakers, and potentially through copies of your book. And then it extended reach through time. So a thought that a person might have written down in a book could potentially reach across spans of centuries to others and communicate in a way that just vastly exceeds what human beings were evolved to have the capacity to do, which is simply communicate with voice one time in the present moment. So I'm reminded of that when you said YouTube and you mentioned professors, because of course it's possible to reach huge numbers of people very quickly now through the internet and with media of various kinds. It's a YouTube video or a 15-second TikTok clip or a tweet or whatever it might be. But those are instances where we have in the past, we've all lived through that. Well, not we all, but many of us alive today have lived to see the internet arise since its inception in the early 90s for practical purposes from the public perspective. And now we have, I think, an analogous situation where it isn't reach, but it's something similar of instancing of your thoughts having the potential to be similarly expanded across time and space and instance. I don't know how you would describe numbers of instances, but instead of communicating a particular message, in this case, it's the reach of your cognition, your mindset, your cognitive faculties, and these are primitive technologies. So as you said, Dan, it's not a perfect replication of one's mind. Presumably, we will get there at some point, where a person might have multiple instances of their entire mind existing simultaneously. But even though this is just a shadow of that, it does point to a similar kind of profound extension of the reach of our minds, in the same way that there was a profound extension of the reach of our thoughts, or our communications, our speech, in I guess, as it were, in the past. And this strikes me as well, I can't think of anything more profound. I sort of lack vocabulary words to describe how profound I think this increase of reach has the potential to be. And this is all separate from the issue of generating fundamentally new instances of intelligence, and let alone generating instances of superintelligence. So this is all just generating instances of subhuman or partial human, fractional instances of a person's intelligence. And even still, it's astonishing to contemplate the implications of that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about why ideas win. So you were talking about the ability to scale ideas or have them survive across time, which is a kind of scaling, right? So your idea gets into the minds of people year after year after year. If you have a book that is printed many times and widely read, but a book sort of requires a level. I mean, if it's a complex idea, it sort of requires something from the reader, right? And if they get stuck, then you lost them. You could imagine a future in which the ideas that influence society are the ones that are packaged most convincingly into bots, right? Not only, I mean, that's very close, of course, to just like the bots that exist on Twitter, right? Uh, the kind of that are just spamming the news sphere with your ideas. But there's a version of that which I don't know if it's on the light side exactly, but just to take an example. So fairly soon, I'm going to augment the version of me that stands at the entrance to metauni with a bot capability. So it will give the little mini lecture on Euclid, and then it'll be pretty tightly constrained to only talk about Euclid and metauni stuff, and it'll have a kind of script that it can query from, but it will answer questions about Euclid and explain why you might care about Euclid. Now, there aren't a lot of people walking around trying to convince you to give a shit about Euclid, right? So having that bot standing there for every random Roblox person who walks past advertising Euclid, well, first of all, that's a kind of model for what advertising will look like. But it's also like, if you want your ideas to spread, it's probably not enough to write books. It's already not enough to write books, right? Books are relatively, well, they've lost their influence, but I mean, I don't know how it's at current prices. It certainly can't compare to the scale of influence you get from viral videos or Facebook or social media in general. But so yeah, but it's different, right? Because it can actually engage with you and respond to your questions. I can imagine many more people getting into topics they wouldn't otherwise get into because they happen to run into something like this that's walking around.
Yeah, this makes me think of another. This is a tangent. Forgive me. It's not perhaps directly related to the discussion here. It seems to me perhaps it's a little bit of an irony, maybe a little bit of a bitter irony, and one that surprised me, and that is that our capacity to, using these new technologies, our capacity to generate content vastly exceeds our capacity for now to digest content. And naively, if I project in my mind back to my earlier self from 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, I think I would have been surprised at that. Again, the generative capabilities of artificial intelligence that we've seen, I mean, the marvelous, astonishing ones we've seen just in the last several years, subsequent to the transformer and diffusion, approaches to these challenges. The success is simply astonishing. But if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have thought it would be the other way around. That the ability to read, to digest a material would have outstripped our capacity to generate it. Or if there was a sequence, that the digestion capacity would have grown massively before the generative capacity. That would have simply been my initial naive intuition. And it turns out, I think, at least as far as I can tell, that seems to not be the case. It seems to be the other way around. But the thing that's bitter about that in this context, and I'm thinking, you mentioned advertising, Dan, in your example of a bot, standing on the corner of, or being somewhere where people can encounter it. And you mentioned also the example of books. It's really unfortunate that I mean, one could imagine the capability of digesting every book, every new book that's written. It's just, you read it, it gets digested. If you have the capability either at some remove from your own mind, or perhaps increasingly integrated directly with your own mind, or in the case of a fully artificial mind, an artificially sentient general intelligence should presumably be able to digest new material fairly straightforwardly at a scale and with a speed and with a precision that certainly superhuman, godlike, as far as human beings, relative to human beings, are concerned. But unfortunately, what it looks like is that the generative capacity of these systems will still overwhelm the digestion capacity. In other words, if we were only producing books at the rate at which civilization was doing so in the year 2010, then an artificial general intelligence or a cybernetically enhanced individual who was super intelligent might perhaps aspire to digest, and read and understand and integrate into their mind every new book written. But now, now that you can press a button and have a new book, generated instantly, and that will only become easier. I'm still grappling with the shock of the fact that we despite godlike capacity potentially to digest information, that there is nevertheless going to be an overwhelming force capable of generating new content. And I don't know if the tables will turn or ever turn or will turn anytime soon or anything, and flip, and the balance of those two things flip. But I don't know if you're struck the same way, that the generative capacity being so vastly powerful so soon. And I don't mean just nonsense. I mean, I'm not talking about just nonsense books being published that have no content in them. I mean, we could do that just with noise. You could just publish, an infinite number of books full of random characters. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about proper content, in the same way that you could now, for all practical purposes, produce an unbounded, shall we say, amount of new art. And people may naysay that and say, well, there's nothing fundamentally new about it because it's derivative. But I think that's a bit nonsense. And in some sense, everything has to be derivative. Everything is derivative plus a little bit of noise from the environment, as far as I can see. And so I just find that shocking. I'm grappling with how unintuitive I still find that this situation where we're absolutely swamped by new content, and it far outstrips our capacity to ingest it and digest it. And the reason why I think this is relevant, just very quickly to circle back and wrap up this thought with respect to advertising and with respect to the dissemination of ideas, say trying to write a book and then getting people to read it, which is very difficult these days. The only reason why that is difficult, the only reason why advertising is necessary or has a function, and the only reason why people put efforts into promoting books and any other message, is because of the finite bandwidth, the finite capacity of human beings as consumers of information and other content. They're very, very finite, very, very limited capacity to ingest and digest that content. Now, if you had a massively greater capacity, 5-10 orders of magnitude greater capacity to ingest and digest material, as it seems some of these artificial intelligence systems will have, then there would be no point in advertising anything. There would be no scramble to promote your book to try to get the message out, because as soon as you wrote it, everybody with that capacity would read it, because everybody would read everything. And that, I was, I guess naively, based on the science fiction leading up perhaps to the year 2000 or so, I was imagining maybe we would get to that kind of future. Now it sounds like, unfortunately, the advertising and the promotion is going to continue to have a role, because there will just be that much more new content that we will still have to filter and still be picky and choosy about, despite vastly increased ingestion and digestion capacity. So not that related to the conversation. I apologize for the tangent, but fun idea anyway.
Yeah, I think if we take that a little bit sideways, here's what I think will happen fairly soon. With regards to not filtering out books, but people. So if you think about now, we take for granted the kind of, we have this problem of there's 7 billion people on Earth. There are limited resources in terms of interesting, well-paying jobs or, even just attention, which is going to become the scarce thing, right? The attention of people with interesting ideas. I mean, how many people would love to have a conversation with Steven Pinker? Well, there's probably millions, right? Steven Pinker does not have that kind of scale. And well, for various reasons, you don't just want to interact with his ideas, right? It's the people who want to talk to Steven Pinker don't want to only interact with a Steven Pinker bot, right? There's kind of status or some kind of like personal interest in having that interaction and making an impact on the real Steven Pinker. Now, right now, how does that work? I guess famous people have agents. You reach them through their agent. They filter out 99.99999% of all the people who want to talk to you. Maybe you meet them at some conference or something. But quite soon, what will happen is that you'll just interact with their AI shadow, right? And if you're sufficiently interesting, you'll get passed on to the real thing. So people will start to surround themselves with layers of kind of delegated intelligence, which are increasingly good. And I mean, the probability that a shadow of me could tell with a short interaction whether or not I would be truly interested in talking to someone is very high, right? It's not that difficult to figure it out. I mean, I get email every day from somebody wanting something that I'm just not interested in talking to. Every academic gets spam emails for lower quality conferences they should go to, or there are students in developing countries, no offense to them, but who are just mass emailing every professor on earth to look for a PhD position.
Right.
I have friends in those kinds of countries who have done that, and I understand why they do it. It's not effective.
Certainly.
They should
Yep.
pursue some other approach, but still,
Yep.
I mean, I get emails like that, and I do reply to all of them and say sorry. I think most people don't even reply to them. Okay, so that's how email currently works, and we have all sorts of layers of spam detection and other filtering to restrict that onslaught of email. And I'm not a famous person. Famous people must get thousands of emails a day that they have to filter through, and they have agents to do it. But it would be, I mean, it's a fairly dystopian, I think, but maybe it's just like that's a status quo bias as well, right? You could say the present is fairly dystopian, where there's just, even if you're, I mean, there are many brilliant young people out there who just cannot get in touch with anybody who would understand them and who would make use of their gifts, right? There are people out there trying to look for such talent, and we have various mechanisms in place to filter that talent up and make use of it. And that's a large reason why we're much more productive in the modern world than we used to be, that we actually discover that talent and properly, well, it's to some degree properly allocated. But okay, so the utopian part is, what if there's just enough agents sitting around that anybody anywhere can log onto a website and have an interaction with that AI, and it picks up some spark of why they might be interesting, and then so there would be much fewer people who get lost. On the other hand, that means that as a young person, you're just facing this wall of AIs that are in between you and everything of value, right? You will not get a position unless you convince 5 layers of AIs associated to various institutions. It's like a never-ending test.
And I should point, I mean, you already mentioned PhD individuals pursuing PhD opportunities, and the necessity of effectively spamming, or pick your metaphor, but just sort of shotgun approaches or carpet bombing approaches to just sending out huge numbers and hoping that 1 or 2 land or stick or something like that. The current job market is very much like that, where there is to some extent a massive coordination shortfall, a massive coordination dysfunction or problem. Certainly globally, and I presume it's quite terrible even within societies, where we really do struggle to match prospective employees with prospective employers. And that is in the very real world of just the realities of the 21st century job market for labor seeking employment. And of course, we can broaden that into a larger, perhaps more abstract category of anyone seeking an opportunity struggles to be matched with anyone who has an opportunity to share and is looking for talent of some sort to seize that opportunity. And that could be, students looking for opportunities, employees looking for opportunities, institutions looking for opportunities. This is our inability to coordinate within the larger opportunity space of our civilization. Even if that we've made vast improvements over where we were a generation or two ago, perhaps we're still vastly suboptimal. And an interesting question in the abstract, I think here is, two questions, one descriptive and one normative. The descriptive question would be, will these new AI technologies make that problem, exacerbate the existing problems, make that coordination challenge worse, or will they make it better? And then the normative question, of course, that follows is, okay, how might these new technologies be used to solve some or all of that coordination problem? And we obviously have very large industries dedicated to and making great grandiose claims about being able to solve some portion of the coordination problem between opportunity seekers and opportunity providers. So dating apps are a great example. Employment services and agencies are an example. There are many others, right? And one could imagine artificial intelligence serving both functions, serving to make this entire problem vastly worse, and also at the same time, perhaps, really making a big difference in superhuman capacity to achieve coordination. I don't know which side is more plausible. Certainly, cynics would be inclined towards the pessimistic outcome there, I suppose. You can certainly see cases being made there. But anyway, it does strike me as something quite fundamental here, and perhaps a very early application, because presumably there's a lot of money, there's a lot of opportunity to extract rents on either side of that coordination problem. In other words, extract rents from people who are seeking opportunities and extract rents from people who, individuals, agencies, institutions, whatever level of organization, but extracting rents from people who are providing opportunities as well. And I know that I've just been involved in the as a potential employer on one side of that. It was very difficult to find the talent that we were looking for. It was a serious challenge.
Yeah. What do you think's more likely, centralization or decentralization, when it comes to the redesign of institutions? So imagine people start taking on board these technologies. The pressure, there's pressures in both directions, right? So there will be new costs associated to baking AI into everything pervasively. Those costs will be easier to pay for centralized institutions. On the other hand, when you read, there's a long old literature about negative takes on centralized education systems, whether it's primary, high school, or university, that envision a more anarchic system, in the positive reading of that word, where people come together and teach each other without a centralized authority kind of extracting rents from that process. You could imagine that being superpowered by these kinds of technologies in various ways. And more abstractly, the question is about coordination. So you were referring to it earlier. That's what we use institutions to do, right? How do we coordinate thousands and thousands of people to push in one direction consistently and over long periods of time? We're really bad at that somehow. So we have solutions. They're better than solutions in the past, but they're still extremely wasteful. It's not clear to me whether the new forms of coordination that will develop are naturally more centralized or less centralized. I can see arguments for both. I mean, you can look at the way China is looking to deploy these technologies and see how it could clearly enable a more centralized form of coordination. But on the other hand, putting more power in the hands of individuals and allowing them to sort and find each other much, much more efficiently seems like it could also lend itself to a more decentralized form of institution.
I hope that this is not a cop-out and is actually a legitimate response to that question. But and there's danger in reasoning by analogy here, as I mentioned earlier, but I'm going to reason by analogy here and say that the analogy I would look to here are ecosystems. And typically what we see when a fundamentally new capability or new resource, more broadly speaking, becomes available to an ecosystem, like if this ecosystem suddenly has more energy in it, or suddenly has an influx of a new a new nutrient, for example, what we tend to see in very large ecosystems is not not necessarily a singular convergence towards one or the other form of life, but a proliferation of niches and just a general expansion of diversity. And so when we increase the energy in an ecosystem, the energy available in an ecosystem, for example, what we tend to see is more biodiversity in that ecosystem eventually. That there are exceptions. You can have ecosystems collapse into less diverse structures with fewer species, and once in a while you can have an individual species just be so successful that it runs roughshod over the entire ecosystem and destroys niches. But this is all a way of saying that what I suspect will happen, and it sounds like a cop-out answer, is that we will have both more decentralization and more centralization. And so how could that happen? How would you have that? Isn't that a contradiction? Well, it's not a contradiction if you think of it like an ecosystem. If you think of decentralization as niches, then I suspect we're likely to see more decentralized institutions emerge and be viable. In other words, be able to survive in the future because of these technologies and other quote unquote resources, namely other supporting abundance and prosperity, making it possible to simply exist. And at the same time that we see that proliferation of diversity of institution, and that I think broadly aligns with the idea of decentralizing and anarchic structure, I think we will also see an increase in the power and capability, simply because there's more resource available to centralized authorities. And so I suspect we're actually going to see both, strange as that may seem, and because the system will be able to support more. And the analogy here would be more biodiversity, but in this case, it would be something more like more socio-institutional diversity within the socio-institutional system, as opposed to ecological or biodiversity in ecological and biological systems. I hope that makes sense. And again, I could be wrong. There are great dangers in reasoning by analogy across systems that are not comparable. But that would be that's my suspicion. I quite strongly suspect that that's going to be the case. And my money, I would bet against anybody who's putting all their chips on one or the other. Mm. Now, I should add another caveat to that, which is that it depends on your unit of analysis. And I'm taking the entire planet as the unit of analysis. If you're talking about an individual society, then, I mean, and again, scale is relevant to biodiversity. If you're talking about too small a patch of land area, like a square meter, there's only so much biodiversity you're going to have there. And I think it's the same for I think scale it applies similarly to these social institutional systems as well. And so you've got to have geographic scale and everything that entails. Physical scale, scale of inputs, scale of energy, scale of materials, scale of number of agents, human and otherwise, just sheer scale across all the dimensions we can think of. You need sufficient scale to support any kind of diversity at all. So it could be that within individual societies, there will be massive centralization in one society, maybe more proliferation or decentralization of institutions in another society. But as the planet as a whole, I expect to see more of everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm going to have to go a little bit early today, so maybe we have a few minutes to wrap up. Sorry for that.
That's okay. Me too.
Yeah, so any other thoughts on new games? I mean, I guess what we talked about perhaps were new forms of interaction, intellectual dating, where you send out delegates to figure out whether you really want to spend an hour of your precious time to talk to the real thing. I mean, I wonder, maybe
I have one idea.
Yeah,
go ahead, Dan. I do have one idea in answer to that, to the alternate games. But go ahead, please.
I feel like this will make me a better thinker for the following reason. Recording myself and putting myself on YouTube made me a much better teacher and speaker. First of all, because I got to actually experience the lecture from the other side. I could listen to it. I could see how many stupid pauses and repetitions there were, and I made an effort to eliminate them. And I'm much more eloquent interacting with people in this kind of format than I used to be as a result of that interaction with a simulacrum of myself, namely the YouTube video, which is a very primitive simulacrum. I can imagine that if I produced something like one of these bots, as primitive as they are right now, interacting with it might make me a better communicator, a better thinker, and a better speaker. There's a bit of like competitive pressure. I guess eventually I might lose, but until I do, it'll keep me on my toes.
I think that has the potential to play a significant role in certain parts of our education system, certainly. It's one of the roles that bots could perform at various stages throughout a person's education, primary school, secondary school, higher education, that you're receiving a form of feedback about your performance that could be very useful. Holding up the mirror, the proverbial mirror, as a YouTube video of yourself does, and seeing a recording of yourself can very definitely do. Education training of many different kinds makes use of this technique of recording yourself, analyzing it, and then practicing. Sports and athletics come to mind. The idea of individuals and teams reviewing their own performance that's been recorded and is quite a prominent feature of professional sports, for example. So I could see that playing a role in people who have initiative, individuals who have initiative, like you do, of course, Dan, will have already been availing themselves of that capability, just with primitive, as you said, with the primitive simulacrum of recordings of the past. But if we were clever about it, if we were smart about it, we would make that a proactive part of education going forward, and increasingly interactive and challenging and provocative, and scaled to the ability of the, customized and scaled to the ability of the person, of the student, I'm thinking, so that they can be pushed to the appropriate degree, like whatever the optimum is for an individual person to be challenged to near the limit of their ability, so that limit expands. One could imagine using these tools very effectively to do that. And at least part of that will be showing people where they currently are and what their current limitations and weaknesses are, so that they can improve.
Sorry, I missed a little bit of that conversation, so I risk saying something that's already been said. But if you're talking about uses of this stuff in education, then I don't necessarily see how making a shadow is going to be like the killer kind kind of feature that from an educational perspective. But just the ability to have sort of someone directing your sort of learning and providing you with examples and feedback, because having an AI is going to allow you to have basically like a private tutor at a much more affordable cost than a human private tutor. So that seems like the killer feature, because feedback is kind of king when it comes to education, and not just school education, but sort of learning anything. And so my contribution, I think, sort of brainstorming ways that the world might change would be that in an ideal world, I think it would be a positive change if what came out of this was everyone having like a life coach / tutor / maybe a team of these AI tutors that's sort of helping everyone develop to the sort of best of their potential. Maybe sort of talking with a simulation of yourself could be a part of that, but I think just the capacity to give attention to everyone's development and like put them in their zone of proximal development, like you mentioned, Adam, that seems like the killer feature that would be enabled by this.
Yeah, I think I agree. Let me add one element to that, which is that if these AIs were to achieve a higher level of competence than we see today, and we're approaching general intelligence or something more convincingly close to that, such that they were socially competent and could provide valuable social cues, then I can see a very, very powerful role for learning buddies that are AI, who also play a very prominent role in socializing instruction. And because children who are naturally prosocial and have social prowess, things that have been categorized as social and emotional intelligence, for example, those are skills. Some people struggle to acquire those into adulthood. Some acquire them more quickly than others. Some children are blessed with having very strong skills from a very early age. But in some sense, the individuals who are successful with socialization and acquiring those social skills, I think to a large degree, they do benefit from having some sort of internal dialogue or modeling, where there's a little bit of a conscience. It's kind of what we mean when we say, well, what's your conscience telling you? What is the little bird on your shoulder? What is the angel on your shoulder telling you that you ought to do? What would be the thoughtful thing to do here? What would be the considerate thing to do? Oh, maybe you ought to think twice before saying something mean like that next time. How would you feel if somebody said that to you? Well, if you had a socially competent learning buddy along with you, that could at least have the potential to increase the social competence of children who otherwise might suffer from the potential of increased social isolation that goes along with these new technologies, like living and working and schooling remotely, being entertained remotely, not going out onto the playground and interacting with other kids in person, but doing it from behind a computer screen through Twitch and Discord and so forth. It's easy to become unsocialized and socially unhealthy, especially as a child, and lack social appropriate or ideal social development. And so I can see a pretty powerful role for AI there as well, potentially. And then I did have one other suggestion. Sorry, but go ahead and comment, Dan, and then I do have something quite different.
Oh, it was a silly comment, but don't you know the best way to make friends is to drink Coca-Cola, as your AI buddy will tell you?
Well, the funny thing is that that's just a silly advertising line. But alcohol is different. I think there's some legitimacy to that. Alcohol as a disinhibitor has been a social lubricant for millennia, right? And so I think drinking a beer might actually work.
Wait. I thought you were going to say that you'll have your AI shadow with you, not to faithfully represent your thought, but to say the silly things the embarrassing things that'll endear you to other people, but you can't bring yourself to say because you're not drinking. So for people who don't drink, maybe having a drunk bot will be a way of lightening the mood.
It's your unfiltered self. No, well, okay, so here's something funny. Maybe we'll all be like swooning kings and queens and princes and princesses with courts of people, courts of attendees flanking around us. And of course, one is the jester, right? The jester has permission to say things that would otherwise be, taboo. That was one of the roles of that social institution and the person in that role, right? Okay, so I have another, and this one, unfortunately, I hate to perhaps close. If you, Dan, you have to go on a pessimistic note. But one thing that I am very concerned about, and it goes along with advertising, it goes along with job seeking and job advertising, opportunities of all kinds, people looking to solve those problems. And then, of course, in so many other aspects of life, we face this problem of dishonesty, of lying. And cheating through dishonesty. Cheating is a different, there are many different ways you can cheat, but one of cheating in the context of trying to seize opportunities in a competitive space is misrepresenting the facts, presenting a partial version or a rosy version or a patently false version of yourself, and trying to seize opportunities and win the game. And we're asking about how games might change that way. And we have a truly spectacular example of this in American politics right now with this individual, George Santos, that's not even his real name. And he is the media coverage of him is hesitating to say it, but he's very clearly has a severe persistent mental illness that involves compulsive lying. And people are just saying, well, he's a con man and that kind of thing. But I think it's probably quite a bit worse than that. This is a person who is pathologically incapable of being honest, or incapable of not lying. And so anyway, this is why this is a little bit fresh in my mind, as we're faced with this issue. But of course, social media and the so-called post-truth era that we're now living in, Donald Trump being a magnificent example, this is very concerning because AI tools could, just be dumping gasoline on the house fire of dishonesty that already exists, right? And the potential of AI tools to help an individual be dishonest, to help them lie, to help them cheat through lying and dishonesty seems to me quite staggering. And there is talk about, well, what about deepfakes and what about, generative functions that then you can't tell what the truth is? Well, that's a separate problem and a serious one. But I'm speaking specifically about the ability of AI to help you lie. And bad faith actors, bad faith agents who are willing to be dishonest, and in some cases, perhaps just out of desperation, are going to make use of these tools. And these tools will really, really help. Well, they will really up the lying game, right? I mean, if you're trying to lie on your resume or lie in a cover letter or, fake it till you make it in some way, or just lie to a client, or, just be dishonest in any way, ChatGPT is going to be a great asset. And I'll give you one specific example. Dan, I don't know if you've ever encountered this. Possibly it's rare in mathematics. But there is an industry where you can hire people to write your coursework, and in particular, write your master's and even PhD theses, your dissertations. You can pay somebody to write your dissertation for you. And I've seen, sort of AMA, Ask Me Anything sessions among the people who work in this industry. And, how they justify being so dishonest and helping people cheat. And it's quite fascinating. Most of the people who work in the industry are very intelligent, but sociopathic or psychopathic. So otherwise you wouldn't be a criminal, basically, like that, or help other people who are criminal, or cheating, in a massive way. And they get paid a lot of money. And one person was, saw it very much as a game, entirely as a game, and thought it was hilarious that he could spend, one working week cranking out a totally bullshit PhD thesis, a dissertation for somebody in a subject he knew nothing about beforehand, and have it be accepted and the person graduate and have it all be a sham and a fiction. But one could imagine, I mean, if there's already a human industry with human agents willing to act in that capacity, imagine what will happen when AI can do that. So again, a kind of a little bit of a depressing note, but it's a serious cause for concern, right?
Yeah, we sort of started this conversation with Dan's comment about how academics being worried about GPT and writing essays. I'm not sure, Dan, if you were saying that that's like not a problem, or if it's just like a small fish compared to the big changes that are coming. But I mean, it's a calamitous problem for. I mean, I'm applying to be a tutor in a subject at Melbourne Uni in this coming semester, where part of the assessment will be essays, and like that is like there's no response. There's no clear response yet. To me, it feels a little bit like OpenAI has just thrown the entire essay-based education system in the deep end with no defense against this. I mean, there's like potential technological responses that you could do, but I don't know, they're like still in development. It's not clear. Basically, we just have to rethink everything with like a few months notice. And that's really tough. This is a big thing.
Yeah, it is interesting. Although, sorry, Dan, to just one quick thought. In this instance, I do think in the case of the universities in particular and education in general, we do have a fallback and a solution, and that fallback solution is to just an earlier time and era of doing things differently. In the past, you were examined orally. You sat down. I mean, the tri-post exams are still conducted at the Oxford universities. You sit on a three-legged chair, and you are intensely grilled by your supervisors, by your professors. And that is how you pass or fail, at least for parts of the program. And that's not to say that essays have not been part of the educational process for a long time. But I suspect we are going, I mean, what is the alternative? I think we are going to have to fall back to interviews and oral examinations, which will be, for a while, difficult to cheat on and fake. Now, once you have a neural implant that's, putting the words in your mouth, then, that doesn't work either. But then I suppose at that point, who cares? And, if you can do the work, you can do the work. So, and you could at least partly make that argument even now. But at any rate, we do have this older solution we could revert to, suboptimal as it is in some ways. But for dealing with lying, like okay, the president of the United States just gets up on stage and just nothing coming out of his mouth is true, and all of that is being facilitated by AI that are cooking up convincing nonsense. This is a terrifying situation, right? And how would we respond to that? Well, there isn't the same kind of old solution to fall back on, and that's in that and other. I mean, I just picked that one out of a hat, but other situations where dishonesty, turbocharged by AI, would be calamitous. So in the case of higher education, I don't mean to be flippant and say, oh, it's no big deal. I think it's a huge problem, gigantic problem, and you're right that a major part of the challenge is that it's been so disruptive. This isn't something that's slowly creeping up and slowly rolling out over many years. It's, from one semester to the next, we are going to have to solve this problem. And any university that doesn't is in real trouble.
I think on this front, I mean, my take on that is that essays and a lot of the assessment we do, I mean, you have to separate actual assessment, where you're trying to tell whether someone has mastered something, versus an incentive system, right? The examinations and assignments, they're partly just, a means of getting students to pay attention and allocate time correctly. And partly they're about actually assessing people's capabilities. But the assessment part has been cheated on by so many students for so long that I don't believe, I mean, the grades students get on assignments, I don't believe them at all. The distributions are so different from the exam distributions that so many students are cheating. It's sad to say. That I just don't care. I don't know. I don't think they have any value or very little value. They have some value in terms of incentives, and that will be sad if that is disabled because people just paste it into ChatGPT and get out an answer. So maybe we need to do a better job of finding real solutions to motivation and discipline and helping people to allocate their time rather than this crutch of getting people to hand in stuff every now and then. But yeah, I agree. It's very short term, a very small amount of time to be able to find solutions to that. But I find it a little hard to feel empathetic for a lot of the universities where it's always been a sham, and now the sham is uncovered to some degree. But like, you knew it was a sham. You've known it's a sham for 15 years. I'm not saying the particular subject you're teaching is a sham, but it's like, yeah, it's and also I find it hard to get excited about it when there's so many more things coming very soon. Of course, I'm teaching Calculus 1 next semester, so you know, I maybe would have a different tune if the AI could be submitting their homework, but they're already solving their homework on Wolfram Alpha and just handing it in. So, like, what's the?
Well, and part of it is Dan, you mentioned not feeling too sorry for the universities, and to some extent, they've made their bed and they have to lie in it. I think this idea, I agree. Sorry, let me back up. Examinations, written examinations, and essays are evaluation tools that scale pretty well. And especially the multiple choice ones, which are very common in the United States. Essays have fallen out of fashion, and multiple choice tests are the norm. Long answer and essay answer, even short written answer questions on exams are they still exist, but the larger the class and the greater the scale that's being attempted, the more likely you are to have an examination format that is dehumanized and depersonalized, and the multiple choice question format is sort of in the extremist. You know, that's it in extremis. And of course, those tests can be machine graded. They don't even need to be graded by a human being, right? So, at least part of this problem is a consequence of the universities scaling and growing too big for their britches.
Agreed.
And taking on more students than they can properly instruct and evaluate. Now, if your student to instructor ratio was 1 to 5, then it would be a very different situation. You wouldn't need multiple choice tests, and one instructor could grade all of their 5 students' work and on a very personalized level and evaluate them very closely and use a variety of different tools. But when it's one instructor and 500 students, there's no way to grade 500 essays in any reasonable amount of time. So of course you have to use multiple choice tests. And that is not the fault of the professor. And to some extent, the students are victims of that scale.
I think we can put some blame with the professors. It's very convenient for academics to say that all the problems are due to the administrators, but our salaries have been going up very rapidly. There's many more professors than there used to be. Now, the increase in the number of administrators is even more dramatic, but there are a lot of very well-paid professional jobs out there being professors, built on the back of scaling up universities to a degree that never was sustainable, and now the bill is coming due. And I think professors as a class, we can take plenty of the blame for that. We were happy to go along with it. So I think that, well, as will happen to every class of human beings over the next 10 years, the bills are coming due for all our misbehaviors and rent-seeking. And we will line up one by one to collect that bill and cry about it. Okay, on that note.
On that note, okay. Thank you, guys. We'll
Thanks,
see you next
everyone.
week.
Yeah,
Take care.
yeah, that was fun. Okay.